Hello and welcome to Newswire. Now we're fast approaching the end of this year, 2019, and as we do that, we want to get a handle on what essentially has been the overall picture in regions that we've been talking a lot about on Newswire, and one of them is Libya, and not just Libya in itself, but of the regional powers and the power play unfolding in this country. So recently what we've seen is that Libya has called out to Turkey for assistance, for military assistance, and Turkey has shown its readiness to meet that request as early as in a few days or a week or so, depending, of course, on the Turkish parliament and how it moves forward. But at the same time, a lot is unfolding in Tripoli as pro-government forces have targeted the LNA, the eastern government being led by General Haftar attacking Tripoli airport, and the pro-government forces attacking them in return. Now, the UN-recognized government of Libya, the Libyan government of national accord, they've also called out two world leaders asking for help in controlling Haftar. But the strategy here is very different on the ground. For that, we will be talking about this and also what is the 2020 looking like for Libya with our guest. Let me introduce who we have today on the panel. We have Mr. Erim. He's joining us from Istanbul. He's an analyst. And also we have today's journalist joining us from Tripoli, Mr. Semir Sejfovic. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Sejfovic, the situation here in Tripoli is much more complicated than just a renegade general trying to eliminate corruption. Tell us first, let's start from the beginning for our viewers, spell it out to us what the situation is in Tripoli at the moment as the latest conflict between these two powers unfolds.
Well, the war is definitely very difficult and it's very, very intensive. The fire is very intensive. The heavy artillery bombardment is very intensive. The GNA, the UN-recognized government here in Tripoli, has been attempting of repelling these attacks from the LNA. There's a militia made up of mercenaries by the warlord Khalifa Haftar, and they are really not choosing means of how they will get to Tripoli. I'll give you an example of how bad the situation is. They have attempted of targeting an airport here near Tripoli. Instead, they targeted a home in which a woman died and a couple of children were injured. This militia, which is attacking Tripoli, the LNA, is made up of mercenaries such as the Wagner, a Russian group. Now, there haven't been any official Russian soldiers on the ground besides mercenaries. Then you have Sudanese mercenaries who are pouring in on the other side. It's basically an army made up of militias who are willing to give their lives for a couple of dollars. And that is the army which is attempting of overthrowing, which is essentially a coup attempt by Khalifa Haftar, using the LNA militias to overthrow the government here in Tripoli, which will have a negative effect on the whole region, not just Libya. It will definitely affect the Mediterranean. It will affect Italy with the flow of migrants. Most migrants are leaving from Libya. It will have a geopolitical effect, and it's going to ripple over into Egypt, into Tunisia, if this situation is not resolved in a peaceful manner.
And that's what's worrying because, Mr. Erim, help understand this a little bit. The Turkish support for the UN-recognized government has always been there, but it is being challenged by those who support Haftar. Now, Turkish response to this Russian mercenaries, by some numbers over 1,000 present right now, supporting Haftar's forces, besieging the capital also. Something like this has caused a major shift, and we've seen it with what has been transpiring between the UN-recognized government and Turkey. Tell us a little why and what is the importance that Libya has for Turkey that it continues to back the UN-recognized government.
Well, Turkey has been supporting the government of national accord since it's been recognized by the UN. And this very important maritime deal that was signed between both countries on November 27th increased the GNA's strategic importance for Turkey. And Turkey also understands that the GNA has come under a lot of pressure due to that agreement. So Turkey is making sure that it is protecting its allies that have stood with Turkey. Now it's Turkey's time to stand with those allies. And it understands that there were many countries that were trying to block Turkey out of the Mediterranean and imprison it in coastal waters, which this agreement kind of ended that political strategy, most namely countries like Greece and Cyprus. Now, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the GNA, most namely from Egypt and when we say there's been a Haftar push towards Tripoli, we shouldn't call it a Haftar or an LNA push. There's an Egyptian and a French push towards Tripoli right now. Haftar's forces are not enough to contain or handle the GNA if it wasn't for his foreign backing. Now, as I was stating, Turkey has very important maritime interests in the region and a very deep historical bond with Libya dating back to the Ottoman centuries. And there was supposed to be a Turkish troop deployment bill that was going to be voted on in Turkish parliament January 7th. But due to the dire situation on the ground in Tripoli right now, the Turkish foreign minister is already visiting opposition parties right now, presenting that bill, which will most likely be tabled for a vote on January 2nd. So we see Turkish parliament most likely convening before it reopens, almost in an extraordinary manner, just to meet and vote on this bill, which I see as a 99% chance of getting passed and approved. So we will most likely see Turkish forces, Turkish troops with boots on the ground in Libya, probably by mid-January.
And that's what's worrying here, Mr. Sejfovic, because while into a UN report, Egypt, the UAE, France, Jordan, they're all supporting Khalifa Haftar. And on the other hand, we're going to see Turkish troops now on the ground backing the UN-recognized government with arms and ammunition. Is this country going to become a full-fledged battleground for multinational warfare?
It's already become that. I agree with Yusuf, Erim, in terms of the international community didn't really get involved until Turkey proposed it was going to send troops and possibly military assistance to its ally Libya. That is actually the point where the international community, their lights just went off. And I believe that this is an attempt of preventing Turkey from asserting its influence in this region. And not just in this region. There's a big power play between Turkey and Egypt in the Middle East in terms of Syria, Iraq. There's this alliance between Russia, Iran, and Turkey who are attempting of building peace agreements, for example, in Syria. So the conflict in terms of an international conflict in Libya is already happening.
Right.
Egypt is involved. Sudan is involved in terms of mercenaries. On the other side, Egypt is lobbying with European partners not to allow Tunisia and Algeria to sit at the table if it does come to a peace agreement or a peace discussion panel in Germany later this month, which has been announced. Italy, for example, has been playing both sides of the game. They've spoken to Haftar, they've spoken to the GNA. But what's very interesting is France's position. France has been more in contact with Haftar and has provided weapons, sophisticated weapon system, tactical maneuvers, as well as men on the ground. If you remember a while ago, a couple of months back, there was about 6 or 7, I believe, French soldiers who were killed on the outskirts of Benghazi. So very hypocritical in terms of the international community, how it's treating a UN-recognized government.
But then when you speak about here because there's a lot of confusion or, well, irony also on how U.S. is moving when it comes to Libya. It has supported the Tripoli government, the UN-recognized GNA, but at the same time, we saw last April, we saw President Trump in communication with Khalifa Haftar, who was once a one-time U.S. resident in Virginia, a few miles from the CIA headquarters there.
Yeah, that is exactly that is correct. I don't see this as a surprise. Khalifa Haftar is a man with a very thick military background. If you keep in mind that he took part in the coup which brought Muammar Gaddafi to power back in the 60s and the 70s. He led the assault on Chad. a failed assault. He is, in general, if you look at his military stance and his history and accomplishment, he is a failed general. Remember, he was exiled by Gaddafi and was welcomed by the U.S., who at that time had an embargo going on Libya, had multiple sanctions using the UN Council on Libya. And here, all of a sudden, they welcome a guy that Gaddafi exiled. There's a plan in the background with what they want to do with Haftar. But in those terms, everybody here in Africa, if you speak to the countries in the African Union, the Arab League, everybody's aware that Haftar is not a man which is going to stay as a leader in Libya. I've just had a chance, for example, yesterday to speak to a man who has come from Benghazi to fight LNA fighters here in Tripoli. Now, Benghazi is mostly aligned with the LNA and Haftar, but this man was telling me that his whole family was executed, their homes were torn down, and you will see more of that. Haftar's position in terms of the U.S., he's just a player they're going to use for as long as they need him for, and they will get rid of him when they have no interest in him obtaining that position anymore. He is definitely not a leader. He's a warlord, another dictator, probably worse than Gaddafi was. And I just feel very, very bad in terms of my personal view of this is you cannot allow a man like Haftar to rule a country which had the most developed index in one of the African countries back just maybe 2011, 2010. You cannot hand over a country with such rich resources to a man who has a proven track record of atrocities, bloodshed, executions, and incarceration of dissidents and torture.
But maybe, Mr. Sejfovic, this is not the end game at all planned by those who are involved here. I mean, Turkey and Russia, this is for them a major play on who gets what out of the Mediterranean Sea. This is a massive energy race. It has huge gas reserves. Mr. Yusuf, you can spell this out for us. The kind of lucrative resources for these countries, this is essentially why Turkey signed that very important accord with Libya on November 27th, because it's about who gets the supplies, which Europe needs very badly.
Definitely. The Libyan conflict is so much bigger than Libya for any of the foreign players that are involved. Libya is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world right now. Turkey's involvement, obviously, its interests are maritime, and this maritime agreement that Turkey signed with Libya, Turkey's not eyeing Libya's natural resources, but we see countries like Italy and France who have had a colonial history with Libya, where they have been able to procure at very cheap, lucrative prices Libyan natural resources and exploit them for themselves. Hence their interest in Libya as a country and this conflict in particular. Obviously, Egypt as a border country, Tunisia, Algeria as border countries, they have national security concerns as well. Containing Haftar, something that Semir touched on, is something that is going to become a growing concern, especially for Tunisia and Algeria. There has been threats from LNA officials to Algeria and Tunisia, and the growing concern is that this conflict could spill over into its borders as well. So that's something that's going to be watched very closely as well.
It's also pitched Turkey against Russia once again. We've seen how it's unfolding in Syria, but what will happen now? Is there a conflict of interest because of the parties they back in Libya?
I don't think there's a big problem between Russia and Turkey right now. Turkey is going to be, once this deployment bill is passed, much more invested in Libya than the minor Wagner footprint that Russia has. There will be Turkish combat troops on the ground, most likely naval assets. If Turkey can procure an air base on lease from either a neighboring country, or if they find it safe enough to touch Turkish aircraft down, they'll even have an air force footprint in the country, which is possible. This is not, from a Turkey-Russia perspective, it's not the same as Syria, because in Syria, both countries are very invested, but in Libya, Turkey will be much more invested due to its interests and due to the footprint that it will have Wagner is a way for Russia to get a cheap seat at the table without allocating a lot of serious military resources. They're trying to find a seat at the table in Berlin, whether it be Berlin or maybe a small Astana type group that could be formed with Turkey. So Russia's trying to protect itself by having a voice at the table, but I don't see it's nearly as important to Russia from a foreign policy or national security perspective like Syria is.
Well, Russia did have a huge print there during Gaddafi, and after his downfall, they did lose traction. But it is seen, because of the lucrative sort of gas reserves there, it does see Libya as an important place to have a foothold in, which is why the mercenaries, though they don't recognize them as their own military, they've been present and increasing in numbers. Well, moving on, Mr. Sejfovic, we want the EU. It's been seen trying to play a bit of a mediator role between Haftar and the GNA. But what has it yet achieved? And is there any fate in the proposed 2020 talks in January that a peace deal is even achievable between the two with the help of the EU?
I don't think the EU is not really, to be honest, I don't think people really care about what many from the EU are saying right now. You had the Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte actually have a phone conversation with Vladimir Putin in which they stressed the importance of resolving this conflict diplomatically. Russia is not involved directly on the ground, and Yusuf touched on this. These are mercenaries. Now, when you look at their behavior and the statistics of how many they've sent there, and they seem very scary, but in those terms, the GNA has arrested dozens of them in the past couple of days. In terms of terms of European diplomacy here on the ground, it is very weak. Right now, the players that everybody from here is looking at is Turkey, is potentially Russia on one side, and on the other side, it's Egypt and the UAE. The U.S. is playing it's been quite silent on this issue, and I still believe that the European Union will have the biggest toll to pay at the end of the day, because if Tripoli falls and if Libya turns into chaos, remember at Muammar Gaddafi's last UN address, he has already warned them, in case that Libya falls, there will be a river of migrants flowing into Europe. Europe is already at a point where it cannot take any more immigrants, refugees, economic migrants, call them whatever you want. These people want to have better lives. It is not all right to overthrow governments, to have European countries who were on the side of the coalition to take out Gaddafi. If you go back, Berlusconi owed Libya money. Sarkozy owed Libya money. Most of the banks in Italy were owned 49% by the Gaddafi family. For example, the football club Juventus as well. So where is Libya's money? Has the European Union repaid Libya's debts which it owed to Libya? I believe that at some point in the past, it was cheaper to execute Gaddafi and take him out than pay the money back. If you take into account that during those times, Greece was a failed state, basically, with a lot of bailouts. Portugal was next, Spain, Italy. I don't think Europe has the weight to bring these warring sides to the table and form a peace agreement. I believe that Turkey will play.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Turkey will what?
Big role. Russia will play a big role.
Right.
And I believe it's going to come down to those two countries.
Mr. Yusuf, Erim, EU is at the same time at the risk of facing hundreds of thousands of migrants because Libya has played the role of the gatekeeper in curtailing this flow. Do you have any faith in what it can achieve in the coming summit as a peace deal between the GNA and Haftar's forces?
No, I don't. I also agree with Semir. I think the EU is paralyzed right now, and the major brokers are Turkey and Russia. Once Turkey gets boots on the ground, it will be the single major player in the region. And while Russia is supporting Haftar with a Wagner presence, I don't think they have full faith in Haftar, because in the end, the Russians, from at least Russian analysts that I've talked to, there are concerns that Haftar is more loyal to Washington than he would be to Moscow. So There is maybe a Wagner presence, but nothing more than a private military contractor. And the Russians can be very easily switched over to the GNA side, I think. I know that sounds like a surprise to be coming out of my mouth, but I don't think they're fully invested in the LNA right now, and they are keeping their options open. The Egyptians and the probably more invested in Haftar and would be the parties to actually talk to, but unfortunately Turkey has an estranged relationship with the UAE and a non-starter relationship with Sisi. Obviously, Erdogan does not view him as the legitimate president of Egypt ever since the coup of 2013 that saw Mohamed Morsi overthrown and Sisi brought to power. So that's going to be a complicated situation. Maybe Russia could play mediator between both sides. Maybe the EU can play mediator. But President Erdogan has also stressed that if the fighting does not stop in Tripoli, that Turkey may not even attend the Berlin process because they might not see a reason to go to Berlin if the fighting hasn't stopped, since there being no grounds for any type of diplomacy with ongoing kinetic military operations in the country. So that's something interesting to follow. Also, President Erdogan pushing for Tunisia, Algeria, and Qatar to be represented at the Berlin process. He wants to see regional countries and Muslim countries represented there, since this is a MENA, Middle East, North Africa issue. He wants to see Muslim countries. He wants to see North African countries. He doesn't want this just to be Turkey versus the EU states in Berlin trying to negotiate Libyan peace, which it shouldn't be. If this is going to be an international diplomatic effort, there needs to be regional countries represented.
Right. And with that, we'll have to end this part of the show, but this argument continues to go forward as the Berlin peace process will take place in January 2020. A lot to be expected, because if Libya continues to be a flashpoint, and in the near future between Russia and Turkey, it would be an ongoing civilian unrest for the Libyans. 140,000 have already been displaced within, and hundreds killed in the war that is going on between the UN-recognized government and Khalifa Haftar's rebel forces in the east. And with that, thank you so much, Mr. Yusuf, Erim, and Mr. Sejfovic, for joining us for this conversation. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. Now, the protests in Iraq against the ruling elite and their corruption, they're continuing for almost now 4 months, despite being met with batons, with tear gas, and at times even live rounds that have killed nearly 460 to 490 people by different accounts and injured up to 25,000 Iraqis. Now, in a latest development over the weekend, we saw the protesters take over the Nasiriyah oil fields in the south of the country, and they forced officials there to shut it down until further notice. So, as we said, we have seen these protests and we've examined them going forward in various episodes of Newswire, seeing that the protests are continuing. We want to talk about today that are these unprecedented in their scale, because similar protests against the sitting government have taken place before in the past. We will also be looking at the importance of OPEC's second largest producer of oil, Iraq's geostrategic relevance to the US and other power players in the region, and also what lies ahead for these protesters of Iraq in 2020. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel of experts. We're looking to Mr. Akeel Abbas is joining us from Washington, D.C. He's an analyst and also an assistant professor at the Department of English at American University of Iraq. We have with us a political analyst and lecturer at Ibn Khaldun University joining us from Istanbul, Mr. Hakkı, Öcal. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. I would like to start with you, Mr. Abbas, for your analysis of these protests taking place in Iraq. They will be now 4 months in January. How would you assess these as in light of how protests in the past in Iraq have taken place? Are these on a whole new different level? Are they any different from the protests? And how are they different from protests in the past?
Thank you for having me on your show. I agree with your initial assessment. These protests are unprecedented, actually, in the entire history of Iraq, but particularly after 2003. Why? Because these protests actually do want to change the regime in a significant way, the political regime, through the mechanisms that the regime has in place, the constitutional, methods. The previous protests were about specific demands, services, employment, so on and so forth. But these protests, although they include these sorts of demands, they put all of these demands within a political context. Basically, these protests are saying these issues will not be solved if this political elite does not leave. Okay, so this is really the most significant development, is that demands, economic, socioeconomic demands are being put within a political context, and basically saying the political context has to change in order for these demands to be met. So I think that is what's important, and the level of awareness among this generation of protesters is really very important, because sectarian identity, ethnic identity does not play a role in the way they're conducting things. There is a sense of Iraqiness, and that if things get done, they have to be done through Iraqi institutions in the context of a sense of equal citizenship. And this is another very important development, because in the past, Iraqis dealt, even not only politicians who really planted this idea and fed it, but also Iraqis accepted that they are groups, components, and the Iraqi constitution has mentioned the components of the Iraqi people. So it's a set of groups, and these groups negotiate through their own political representatives. Right now, the whole idea of components is out. No, we are people. We're Iraqis. Deal with us as Iraqis. So I think these protests will change the face of Iraq over the long term.
And we've seen Adil Abdul Mahdi's resignation. Now we're seeing the president of Iraq also saying that if the pressure continues, he will resign. But Mr. Hakkı, we are also seeing analysis coming in that this is reminiscent of what we saw after the 1991 Gulf War, when 14 out of 18 of the provinces, there were protests, but those protests ended very brutally with the government security forces killing tens of thousands of Iraqis in the south alone. Is that the kind of risk we are seeing now? Because there have been reports by Human Rights Watch have come out with a report saying that the Iraqi government is complicit in those being killed, innocent civilians protesting being killed, those being picked up and abducted with no signs of where they are. Are you concerned that these protests could also come to this kind of a bloody end?
Of course, in every society, even in Turkey right now or in Egypt, people do have grievances. However, whenever you have a political process that can redress such grievances, you don't have to worry too much. Now, in Iraq, since the United States and their cohorts, coalition, ruined the social fabric in that country, there is no way for anybody, any political organization, any political party, or any group to redress those grievances in the society in a proper way. So people are protesting, and the regime is trying to defend itself, assuming that each and every protest is against their very essence, and it is also foreign dominated things, and they respond very angrily and with incredible force, unproportionally force, and people are dying, and there is no hope for the youth in Iraq for any future. You may be Shia, you may be Sunni, you may be Kurdish, you may be Arab, it doesn't matter. I mean, the country's future is bleak, and there is no way for the political elite to rechannel those grievances and everything. And only way out of this mess is to sit down and rewrite the Iraqi constitution by the Iraqis, not by the American governors, not by the American...
By the American, that comment in itself is going to lead into my next. Here, let me welcome another voice who's joining us. Mr. Ahmed Rushdi, analyst and senior foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, is joining us from Baghdad. Mr. Rushdi, the concern about Iraq's constitution, how it perpetuates the idea of sectarianism, inculcates it in a society, driving it to conflict and worsening the divide, that has been sort of traversed by these protests, which have put aside those sectarian differences. The demand for a change in constitution, the demand by the Iraqis to finally do away with the international powers meddling, the influence of regional players, whether it's the US or the Iran. Is that a possibility of change we are going to see before things go further south?
The blame should be put on the shoulder of the political blocs. It not should be put on the shoulder of the constitution or the political process. Because if we change the constitution, if we're going to change the political process and the elite will stay there, the corruption will stay there. So what happened is that in the 1st of October and the flare-up of the demonstrations made a marvelous movement toward making some sort of reforms inside the parliament, especially in voting for the electoral law and the electoral committee. And maybe we're going to go forward for early elections, maybe in 6 months or maybe 1 year.
So the Iraqi President Barham Saleh, who said on Thursday that he is ready to resign before the parliament. This is going to happen.
I don't think so. Barham Saleh will not resign.
Because any of the nominations that have been made for Prime Minister have been outright rejected by the protesters, claiming that these are again the representation of the kind of influences from foreign forces that they are fighting and protesting against.
Yes, correct. But today there is a new candidate who is General Abdul Ghani al-Assadi. He is the head of the Golden Brigade. That he is also the head of the anti-terrorism forces, and he's very accepted by the demonstrators because of his history fighting against Daesh, and also try to manage things while the war is on the road. And he actually managed the civilians issues well at that time. So Abdul Ghani al-Assadi is now a strong candidate to be the prime minister. I think Barham Saleh, he is a candidate for the biggest bloc, which is Al-Bina. I think Barham Saleh, the president, will accept him in a way or another. And he's also near the Americans. He's also accepted by the Americans. So maybe we're going to reach some sort of a settlement today or maybe tomorrow.
Mr. Ahmed Rushdi there, George from Baghdad, thank you so much for your input. Coming back to you, Mr. Abbas, while the situation remains in the positive, as it seems, for the protesters, that there will be changes in the constitution, that their voices are being heard, but what doesn't remain changed is the influence that the US and Iran has in Iraq, and these are pitched against each other at the expense of the civilians there. We saw in 2016 the kind of protests that took place. They were again driven by these political parties in a way that to sort of get support for undermining their opponents. But here, this time round, do you see any catalyst of change here when it comes to foreign meddling in Iraqi politics?
I mean, let's talk first about changing the constitution or the text of laws. There is a law that's being talked about in terms of changing the constitution here, changing this law, changing that law. There is almost a consensus among the Iraqi public and even the Iraqi political class to change texts of things. However, the protests are actually not about changing the text of things. They're about changing the behavior of the political class. In other words, the Iraqi constitution does not stipulate that politicians should be corrupt or politicians should do this ethno-sectarian, division of spoils and power, so on and so forth. Yes, there is a discussion about the constitution, but it's not primary. It is not the motive why people went out in the street. Why people went out in the street is primarily because corruption. And that brings the whole issue of foreign meddling. In general, the protests are not really significant in terms of the foreign, meddling. First of all, there's less talk about the United States. So far, we haven't seen one slogan against the United States in these protests. There are slogans against Iran, and particularly because of the association of the repression of these protests with Iran. The groups in Iraq that are close to Iran have been accused of basically using violence against the protesters, and that what started the issue of raising Iran as a concern among the protesters. However, in terms of specific political steps or demands, the protesters haven't actually asked for anything in this regard. Why? Because the relationship between Iraq and Iran is really not an institutional relationship whereby you can basically ask, do this, do that, our relation with Iran should be cut or this or that. The primary issue is that you have political parties and military groups in Iraq that are ideologically aligned with Iran. So when you solve the issue of the political parties themselves, you have a meaningful party, law that would follow up on, foreign donations. When you have a meaningful party law that does not allow parties to have military wings, so on and so forth. So strengthening really the Iraqi laws and applying them, in a fair and transparent way should take care of these things. There is really not like this confrontation between the Iraqi protesters and Iran that is made up. Lots of foreign media talks about this. Yes, there is anger at Iranian meddling in Iraq.
That is not the gist, like the main gist. I hear what you're saying here, but I want to get Mr. Öcal's opinion on this also. Mr. Öcal, do you agree with this point of view that it is more about fighting the corruption, fighting those executing the political system and the laws?
Yes, I agree with the gentleman. The issue is here foreign meddling. However, the elite, which is really, when we say, okay, Iran should take its hands off Iraq, then who are going to deal with those elites in the country? America should get out of Iraqi politics. Then who is going to stay and who is going to do things for the Iraqis? It is the Iraqi people. It is the Iraqi elite. Yeah, that's true. Look at Holland, for instance. Look at Belgium. Those are multi-ethnical, multi-sectional countries. And in such countries, the elite should get together in the first place, and they have to agree for the benefit of the country, for the benefit of the people in the first place. And then things go to the parliament. Now, there is no such a group in Iraq to do that other than the Kurds. Only the Kurds are fighting for Iraq, but all the Shia people are fighting for their very regional, very parochial interests. First of all, the Iraqi elite should get together and they should sit down and say, okay, enough is enough. From this point on, we are taking the reins in our hands and we will solve our problems. Stop the embezzlement. It is very easy. You can do it if you decide on the top. Look, may he rest in peace, President Öcal years ago said that even the one single red penny changing hands in a remotest village should find its way all the president's level, otherwise those corrupt people cannot survive. That's true. If the elite on the top wants to stop the corruption, they can do it. If they stop getting payment themselves, they can fight with the corruption. When you fight with the corruption, it is very easy to find ways to increase the employment level in the country. It is a young country. There are lots of...
But then, Mr. Öcal, the question is, who would take their place? Who would be able to replace those political elites who have been in power for generations?
Anybody who is not in the payroll of Iran or United States can lead this country to the salvation. It is very easy. It is that simple.
So, Akeel, Abbas, coming back to you, running out of time, it really does come back down to the international interference. I mean, this is OPEC's second largest oil producer. I mean, of course, the US has a lot of stake in here. With the sanctions on Iran, the kind of shortfall, it has to be met by somebody, and US has been relying a lot on Iraq for this.
Okay, I mean, in terms of the political elite to rule, I think this is the $1 million question. There is almost an agreement that this current elite cannot continue to govern the way it's governing. What the elite is saying is that we are going to change behavior. What the protesters in most of the street are saying is that no, you are not going to change your behavior. We've tried this. You need to be out. Now, this is the sticking issue. How are you out? For the protesters and most people, it's a transitional process. Early elections and a new election law. They passed the new election law, and it's generally a good law. Now the issue, who is going to monitor the elections? Because these parties are represented in the Electoral Commission, and the Electoral Commission more or less is widely suspected of cooking the results. So this brings the element of international help, you want to call it international interference, whatever, is that you need some sort of international player to ensure the integrity of the process, the integrity of the election process. So when early elections are held and the results come out, not in the interest of the current political elite, that there is a process, there is an international, actually the trickiest and most difficult issue to solve, the end game. How do you basically transition this current political class out of power and bring a new, political elite? And I think this is something that will take a number of years. Even if elections are held today, this political class will still have some voice. It will still have some people voting for it.
Right.
But then, I mean, all of this is to be seen if it is agreed upon the process of how to do this. So far, there is no agreement. They have talked about
agreement. They talked about it. The protests, meanwhile, continue. It's going to be the fourth month in January. The protests were started over poor living conditions, have also been about corruption, and have forced Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi to resign. And now the pressure is on the president to also step down. What happens in 2020 as the protesters cross the year into January? We will be monitoring and analyzing. Now it's come to the part where we have to say goodbye. So thank you so much, Mr. Hakkı, Mr. Abbas, for joining us here in this conversation. We will see you tomorrow with more news and analysis and stories. Till then, goodbye.